In this video, I'm going to critique and edit your photos. What's up guys, Reggie B Photo here and welcome back to the channel. For those of you who are new, my name is Reggie Ballesteros and I'm a wedding photographer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Last month, I invited you guys to submit your photo for the first ever Reggie B Photo Critique. And to spice things up, I also invited you guys to send over an unedited RAW file if you wanted to see how I'd personally edit your photos. But before we jump into the first photo, I wanted to make a few disclaimers. First, it takes a lot of courage to submit your photo to be seen and judged by everyone here on YouTube. So thanks so much to everyone who submitted a photo. And to everyone watching, let's remember that once upon a time, even the greatest photographers started out as beginners. So let's be sure to keep the comments respectful and positive. And ultimately, these monthly photo critiques are to help all of us learn to be better photographers. They are not intended to discourage or tear each other down. And second, remember photography, just like art in general, is subjective and based on personal preferences. And on that note, my critiques and edits are all based on my personal preferences, aesthetics, and style. I am in no way claiming that my edits or my suggestions are any better than the original photographer's edit or vision. It's just simply my take on how I would personally shoot it and maybe some suggestions on things for them to try the next time around. Alright, with all that said, let's jump into the first photo. So this first photo was submitted by John. Thanks John. And he shot this with a Fujifilm X-H1 with the 10 to 24 millimeter wide angle zoom lens. And he zoomed it to 24 millimeters. And as far as the exposure settings go, shutter speed was at 1/320th of a second at f9 at ISO 400. And this photo is lit with an off-camera flash, which you guys will see in a minute. So first things first, solid wedding portrait. It's not easy to steal the couple away from a busy wedding day for portraits. And here you even had time to break out the flash, set up an octobox. So kudos on that. And if it wasn't impressive enough, this dude is a Photoshop whiz as he managed to clone out 3 trees and the off-camera flash. And if you've tried photoshopping something that overlaps the subject, it's not an easy task, especially around the head and the hair. So just to warn you from my edit, I will most likely not be able to get rid of all that stuff in Photoshop. Heck, I probably won't even bother. So here I like the lighting. It's nice, soft, it's directional, and you know, sometimes using off-camera flash can come off super overproduced. But this one is just right for me, and I like the composition here. I can tell that you are very aware of all the lines and natural frames in the photo. A couple is evenly in between these 2 vertical poles of this railing, and their heads are in this darker shape area here. And you've also got the railing as a leading line to draw the eye to the couple. Again, solid wedding portrait and solid composition here. So a couple things that I would personally have done differently. First off, because I suck at Photoshop, I probably wouldn't have had them right in front of this tree, or at least having the heads intersect the tree, because I knew I personally wouldn't be able to fix it in Photoshop. But you did a great job removing the tree trunk. Aside from that, here I kind of want to see a little more of the bride's face. I would have put her nose on the other side of the groom, so her face was more featured instead of being blocked by the groom's face. And actually, if possible, I would have had the bride and groom switch places, with the bride's face facing the light instead of the light falling on her backside. So whenever I light couples, I want the most flattering light on the bride. It's just my preference. Another thing is that the couple's head and hair gets a little lost in the background. If you had a second off-camera flash at your disposal, I probably would have had one either behind the couple with their heads hiding it, or out of the frame to camera right. So this light would be able to give their heads and hair some nice separation from the background. And lastly, since you're so good at Photoshop, if I had your skills, I probably would have also went ahead and got rid of these manhole covers at the bottom left of the frame as well, just because, you know, might as well just get rid of all the distracting elements here. So all in all, minor things, still a super solid portrait, and good job, John. So John also sent me over a RAW, so let's take a stab at editing this shot. So first things first, we're going to start off with my Fujifilm color preset. And of course just bring up the exposure a little bit. Then here I'm going to increase the contrast and clarity just a touch. So now we can work on fine-tuning the shadow and highlight details here. So now at this point it's a good time for me to fix the white balance of the photo. Since this is a portrait, I'm going to zoom into the skin tones just to make sure that the white balance and the tint of the skin is just right. And since I'm already zoomed in, I'm going to refine my sharpening mask here. Probably going to increase the noise reduction just a little bit. And then I'm always coming back and refining the tint, the white balance, since right now the skin is looking a little too green for me. And then before I drop in the gradient filters to do a vignette, I'm probably going to want to revisit the highlights one more time. Let's try to bring out a little bit more detail in that dress. Okay. So now I'm going to bring in some graduated filters to slightly darken the edges of the frame, and we can tailor it to just around the couple here. Alright, let's check our progress here. So I'm thinking I want a little bit more punch, so I'm going to add, 5 or so to dehaze. Okay, so a few more white balance tweaks here for the skin again. And at this point, it's actually looking a little too faded to me, just because low-key photos with my preset sometimes get a little bit too faded. So I'm going to drop the blacks down here. Okay, and I think that does it for my edit. So this next photo was submitted by Lennon. Thanks Lennon, and I believe it was shot with the Sony a7 III with a 50mm 1.8 prime lens. And as far as exposure settings go, shutter speed was 1/1600th of a second at f1.8 at ISO 100. So right off the bat, this is an awesome shot of this dog. I have a dog myself. He's definitely nowhere as cool looking as this one, but I know how hard it is to get them to be in the right light and in the right spot and still freeze the action. Make sure you get that focus on. So good job, Lennon, on this capture. And it looks like you're taking the photo at, it seems like a brisk morning with some fog coming out of the dog's breath. So props on ensuring that you're in good lighting conditions when taking this photo. And of course you have this awesome flare at the right hand side. I always love me some lens flare. Okay, so lighting wise, this photo is backlit with the sun behind the dog to camera left. And I like how the backlighting gives some nice separation of the dog against that building in the background. And also I think this backlighting is helping the fog of the dog's breath stand out a little bit more. So composition wise, the dog is centered, but I don't really think there's anything in this frame that requires it to be centered. Since the dog is running in a direction from camera left to camera right, I probably would have had the dog over to the left side to convey that he's running, or she's running, and give the viewer a sense of where he or she is going. But of course I'd still have something in the background behind the dog to accentuate that nice rim light that you have on the head and the ears. So having the dog more to the left would probably allow the shadow to be lengthened a little bit more, giving a better leading line to draw the eye to the dog. So crop something like this. And here take note that I made sure to crop so that these two gaps are equal and are parallel with the corners of the frame. I'm always trying to pay attention to little details like this when I'm altering the crops of my photos. So as far as colors go in your edit, I personally like a more natural to the eye color palette. I dig the vividness and the punch of your photo, but looking at the raw photo, it's probably not the direction I personally would have taken it. But again, colors and edits are all preference, so keep doing what you're doing and keep developing this unique style. And since you're shooting on a Sony full frame sensor and at the lower ISOs, I would have actually taken advantage of its ability to underexpose and bring the shadows back up in post. Looking at your raw histogram, you had quite a bit of room for the shadows here, so probably would have helped to save the highlights on the left a little bit better if you underexpose. But all in all, it's a solid capture of this dog, and if this is your dog specifically, congrats on having such a good looking dog. So cool. Let's now head over to the raw and see how I would edit this particular photo. I do have my presets compatible to work with other camera brands, so let's use the non-Fuji preset, and then we're gonna bring the exposure down a bunch because in my opinion it's overexposed for the way that I edit. So and then I'm gonna add some contrast back in. So let's bring up the shadows on the dog's face here, and then work on the highlights a little bit more. Then let's see, let's boost the clarity a little bit and then add some texture here. And then when shooting backlit or into the sun, the dehaze tool does wonders to bring back the contrast into the photo. But you know, for me, dehaze always needs a little bit of shadow boosting to go along with it. So since this is not an X-Trans file, I'm going to have to revert the sharpening settings back to like normal Bayer sensor settings. These are the settings that I used to use kind of close to on Nikon. So let's now fix the white balance a bit and bring in some warmth here. But then I'm going to try to tame the magenta just a little bit. Then let's bring back down a bit that white balance just because it's too warm and I want it to be more natural looking. And tweaking the contrast again here. So now for the gradient filters, I'm going to add an extra set on the left side to just try to tame those highlights. And actually I'm going to put one more here, and then let's tweak the exposure a bit. Again, boosting the shadows gets more light in this dog's face. And then I actually made a crop tweak after I finished the screen recording per what I mentioned in my critique of this photo, which I do feel gives more story and direction as to where the dog is headed, as opposed to a just pure center composition. So this next photo was submitted by Christy, thanks Christy, and she shot this with a Fujifilm X-T2 with the 50mm f2 prime lens. And as far as exposure settings go, shutter speed is at 1/500th of a second at f3.2, and ISO is at 320. So all in all, this is a solid camera aware portrait. So I'm thinking this is a mother-daughter photo, or you know, as a parent, these types of photos are absolutely priceless. The tradition of just looking at the camera and taking a photo is a tried and true thing over history, so I know as much as photographers like to get creative, we also have to be able to just execute solid, like formal portraits like these. Love the expressions, they're very genuine smiles, doesn't look like they're tired of smiling or they're forcing it. And I also like that the heads are closer together, showing very implicit bond. Sometimes for formal portraits like these, the heads are more separated, but I prefer shots like Kristen's right here, which is a little less formal. So as far as the lighting goes, looking at the shadows on the girl's face, it looks like there is some beautiful diffuse light coming off to camera right. So I would have actually rotated the two counterclockwise, maybe like 45 degrees or so. And since the subject is in the shade shadow, in rotating them, I would actually make sure to choose a background that's also darker and in shade. I prefer to have my backgrounds be the same lighting or darker than the main subject of the photo, and also to have the subject be significantly brighter than the background. This will help prevent the background and sky from being, you know, blown out or overexposed. And as far as camera settings go, since it does seem like you underexpose the image intentionally, I would have actually dropped my shutter speed to 1/250th of a second and then dropped the ISO accordingly. That way, when raising the shadows back, there will be a little bit less noise and we can keep all the dynamic range as much as possible in that raw file. And as far as composition goes, you can't really be super creative with these type of shots, but I personally would have taken a few steps back so that their shoulders and arms weren't cut off on the sides of the frame. But I do like the amount of space you have above the subject's heads though, because sometimes people have the tendency to put the heads just dead smack in the center of the frame, which is too much negative space on top. But again, solid portrait, and I'm sure these two will cherish this photo for years to come, so good job, Kristen. So now let's head over to the raw file and see how I would edit this particular photo. So for this one, I'm going to try to do a lot of work to bring back some of the light on their faces, but still retain as much detail in the background as I can. But obviously you want to make sure it still looks realistic and not HDR-ish. So first things first, I'm going to add my Fujifilm color preset here, and then I'm going to boost the exposure right here, and then reducing the contrast a little bit to soften those shadows on the face. Then I'm going to bring up the shadows more on the face here. Then I'm going to drop down the highlights a lot to try to recover what we can in the background here. Adding some clarity. and tweaking the contrast a bit more. Okay, so this photo is nice and sharp here, so let's just adjust the masking accordingly. And then we're watching the background to make sure it's not being sharpened. Okay, now let's get rid of the green in the tint, and then I'm going to add some warmth back in the photo. And if you ever notice skin tones having too much orange or magenta, we can bring up the shadows a little bit and bring up the exposure. And then now there's still a little bit green left in the skin, so I'm going to head over to the HL sliders. And we're going to bring the red hue over to the red side. And then we're going to bring the orange hue over to the red side also. This helps get rid of the greens. But this does have an adverse effect of making the skin look a little too red. So let's reduce the red saturation here. And then I'm going to boost the red luminance. And then I'm going to add a little bit of warmth back in the photo again. And then some more minor tweaks and adjustments to the white balance according to my eye. Okay, let's add a vignette to the photo with some gradient filters. And then since the background is pretty bright, I'm going to pull in a radial filter as well, just not as dark on the exposure. And I'm always tweaking that white balance to get the skin tones just right. So finally I'm going to adjust the white levels just to make sure it doesn't bleed into my white reference background. So I have a white reference background because Instagram has a white background, and I want to make sure that once that photo is posted to Instagram, it has some separation. Alright, I think that does it for my edit of this one right here. And this last photo was submitted by Khalil. Thanks Khalil, and it was shot with a Fujifilm X-T3 with the 90mm f2 prime lens. And as far as exposure settings go, let's see, 1/40th of a second for the shutter speed at f8.0 at ISO 160. So here it's a very conceptual photo with low-key lighting, and that's something I particularly would shoot, but kudos on trying something a little out of the box. You know, it's when we push our comfort zones as a photographer is how we improve the fastest. So good job Khalil on this shot. So looking at the settings, I'm thinking you shot this with a flash, especially because it's at f8, and that would be some pretty strong lighting if you're shooting at f8. So taking a look at the raw, I would suggest that if you're trying to get rid of the background entirely, as your edit suggests, probably have your subject further away from any walls. Additionally, you can feather your light so that it's pointed slightly away from that back wall, or if it's not possible, use like a flag or snoot or grid or any type of other flash modifier to control the spill of the light on that back wall, just because we want to make sure we get it right in camera. And similar to the first photo, John's photo, the subject's head and hair gets a little lost in the black background here, so it might have been good to add another light behind the subject aimed at the hair and shoulders to give some separation here. So I do like that you did choose a black and white conversion, but I would say next time around try to get it again as much right in camera as possible. I think you did like delete the background and just put black, and that kind of leads to the shadows and the background coming off as a little bit unnatural to me, because the transitions from shadow to the highlights right here is a little bit harsh to the point where there is some banding. So again, it's a preference thing, but I personally would have backed off on the contrast just a little bit. Either way, good job Khalil. Thanks for this submission, and you're making me want to experiment with some shots with some low-key lighting like this. So alright, now let's jump in the edit and see what direction I would take this particular photo. So first I'm going to apply my black and white preset here. And don't be alarmed, it drops exposure quite a bit because this photo is mainly highlight based. So bringing the highlights back and boosting the exposure, and then I'm going to tweak the shadows here, and then I want to bring more detail back in the highlights. Okay, there you go. So now I'm going to add some contrast and clarity. And then again, just always continuously tweaking the highlights and the exposure as I go. So now we can tackle the masking of the sharpening here. And I'm going to do -5 on the texture for the skin because it's pretty sharp with that 90mm f2. So now I'm going to add some gradients for vignetting. I'm actually going to straighten this photo for that vertical line. Since this photo is a low-key photo, I'm going to drop the blacks a little bit, just because it's too faded again with my preset sometimes. And then I'm going to add some final shadow tweaks, and I think I'm good. So that's it. That's it for the very first ReggieB photo critique / edit your photo video. Thanks so much for sticking it through, and let me know in the comments down below if you have a better name for this video series. If you like this video, if you learned something, if you want to see more of these, be sure to hit that like button. And let me know down in the comments below if you like the critique portion better or the editing portion better, or maybe both. And if you want to submit your photo and participate in the July photo critique, be sure to go to the link in the description below to submit your photo. Just an FYI, I'll be limiting these critiques to just 5 photos. But those who signed up for my photo critique tier on Patreon will get a guaranteed spot to be included in the next photo critique. And also, if you do sign up for that Patreon photo critique tier, you actually do get my Lightroom preset pack included also. Alright, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I post a new Fujifilm or photography video every other week, just like these two. And if you want to see more of my photo work, be sure to follow me on Instagram at @ReggieBPhoto for a new post every single day. Alright, that's it for me. Remember to get out, go shoot, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.